But first, does debt really matter these days? After all, to counter the GFC, government essentially borrowed $50 billion a year for a decade. And now to counter the pandemic, we're borrowing around $35 billion a month at a federal level alone to keep businesses and households going. Now, given the Commonwealth government can borrow at 2% or less and is able to service debt levels about double what they were back in 2013 when first elected for about the same amount each year, can't we just keep borrowing and spending more and more pretty much indefinitely? So what's the cause? If there's good money out there, let's go and borrow it. Well, there's this notion called modern monetary theory that holds that government can issue bonds at some low nominal interest rate and the Reserve Bank can buy them, and provided the government meets the interest payments, the process can go on more or less forever. So if government needs money, this modern monetary theory goes, they can just get it from the Reserve Bank and Bob's your uncle. I mean, governments with big debt, what could possibly go wrong? It was all just this simple, you've got to ask, don't you? Why would any government in the past have bothered to make themselves so politically unpopular by cutting spending and attacking waste to keep debt and deficit under control? Well, the answer is because it can't go on forever. Sooner or later, people work out that the money supply is expanding way beyond the productive capacity of the economy, and there's a collapse in confidence in the currency. The Reserve Bank might keep lending you money because you can order it to, but no real people will, and the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. Mind you, in the case of sovereign governments with the coercive power of the state behind them, deficit financing can go on for years, sometimes decades, before lenders say enough's enough and the monetary merry-go-round finally stops. The French government, for example, hasn't run a budget surplus in 40 years. It's almost 20 years since the American government ran a surplus, and as we know, the last federal Labor government to run a surplus here in Australia was way back in 1989. But eventually, all of this spending and borrowing catches up with you. You can keep putting things on the credit card, you can keep adding to the mortgage, but unless your income is going up too, so that the debt servicing gets easier, not harder, eventually you come unstuck. And government, just like families and small business, it has to live within its means too. I've been saying for some time that the economic consequences of the pandemic will be felt long after the health impacts have passed. We had the first tremors of that over the past 24 hours, haven't we, with the S&P ratings agency downgrading the credit rating of our two biggest states. The result has been a 2 notches fall for Victoria, from AAA to AA, because much of Victoria's spending splurge is just recurrent spending. New South Wales also fell, although just a 1-notch drop from AAA to AA+, even though its additional spending is mostly on productive infrastructure to keep the economy going through the business failures and extra unemployment that's almost inevitable once the JobKeeper wage subsidy finally tops out next year. Now, none of this is the end of the world right now. None of it is. Paying a slightly higher interest rate on state debt is not deadly when rates are very low. The important thing is to make sure the extra spending is for assets and not just for consumption. That's because, of course, we can't rely on rates staying low forever. And we wouldn't actually want rates to stay artificially low forever. One of the reasons why asset prices are so high and young people can't afford to buy a home, and because there's no point putting your money in the bank, this is particularly retirees, isn't it? Because retiree incomes then are low. The big question is whether any government is now capable of taking tough budgetary decisions like stopping the growth of a public sector workforce in the case of a state government, or reining back government benefits if it's a federal one. The fact that the Australian government's interest burden is still only half what it was in the mid-1980s and a quarter what it was in the 1920s does mean we shouldn't panic. We can always reassure ourselves, I know, by looking to Europe and to America, where government finances are worse. But we are only a collapse in our terms of trade or a really bad government away from serious problems. And constant vigilance is the price of continued prosperity. Look at China. Right now, we're still selling well into this enormous market, but things are fluid and China is aggressively looking to buy elsewhere. So what's Australia's plan B? Where's the work from the federal government on new trade agreements, like the long-promised push for a free trade deal with India, or the EU deal that's now been on the table for a number of years? We can all see that Australia's got a lot of eggs in the China basket. That's not a reason to pull our punches when it comes to standing up for our sovereignty and our values. But it is a reason to be smart about what might replace this revenue for our exporters and getting the work done now to make that a reality. In the end, as you know and I know, government can't spend a dollar that we the people don't stand behind. When governments get into trouble, we the people pay for it, which is why I always prefer a government that thinks before it spends, that saves where it can, that runs a budget in balance, and like households, borrows no more than what's needed with an eye on what the repayments might look like if and when rates start to move up. One thing's for certain, in the next federal election, the coalition's old mainstay of being the better economic managers might still be there, might be true, but it'll have a lot more punch given the state of the books if this spending was under control. The coalition knows this, knows that they haven't got that same trump card on the economy that they've had in the past. They know it, and so does Labor. Being prudent might not be so fashionable in this year of pandemic, but prudence is a fundamental to prosperity. So let's hope some of our leaders rediscover prudence in the new year.